there, people of YouTube land! This is the Dodo Wrestling Fan, here today for episode 2 of Impressions, and today we are going to be doing Final Fantasy VIII. This is just continuing off where we left off last week with, well, I guess technically not last week, this would have been around 2 weeks ago. Yeah, let's just say I was not able to keep up with the 1 week schedule because, you know, I'm a pretty busy dude and I got a lot of things I need to do, but I am able to do Final Fantasy VIII Impressions and I'm going to definitely continue this series because I have a lot of drive and passion for it. So, some backstory. The massively popular Final Fantasy VII kind of overshadows this sort of flawed masterpiece of a game that's known as Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII is hands down my all-time favorite of the PS1 trilogy. There's, like, no doubt about it. I just adore everything about this game. Like I said, yes, you could say it's definitely flawed, but its charms and everything else about it make up for everything in spades. And not to mention, the CG in Final Fantasy VIII is probably, I'd say it even rivals stuff from the PS2 era. Like, it's literally aged so timelessly well. And that actually goes for the art style as well. So I guess maybe that's our first category that we're gonna yak about is the visual style and graphics of Final Fantasy VIII. Now, the lead character designer, Tetsuya Nomura, wanted to have the game to sort of have like this lazy summer kind of school days vibe in his own words, and I think he succeeded really well because, well, I mean, the game does revolve around a group of teenagers, or at least super soldiers, seeds inside Balam Garden, which is a school. So, I mean, I guess it makes sense for it to sort of have a slightly more innocent, schoolish type of vibe to the game. You can also see, like, in a lot of towns, like Balam Town, that, I believe a lot of locations in such as Timber Town were definitely inspired, like, Eastern European type things. We are starting to see this again with Final Fantasy 15, with a more realistic world setting, because Final Fantasy VII did not have a realistic Earth setting at all. It really didn't. Like, it's very slummy but sort of pseudo-futuristic, whereas Final Fantasy VIII feels very grounded. You know, aside from freaking flying schools and whatnot, the game is fairly realistic, I'd say. Like, you know, like being a seed, instead of earning guild traditionally, which you would typically do by just, you know, fighting in battles, you actually get paid a sum for your seed level, which is something that I find unique. Like, seed's like a job. So every now and then, around every hour of in-game time, you'd get paid your salary. So let's just say level 5 seed gets $5,000 an hour, or 5,000 gil if you want to be really specific about it. And it's these little gameplay things that set 8 so differently from the rest. The junction system is the thing that a lot of people have problems with, but I never had any problem with it. You just go into a battle, you get to choose your magics from what enemy you're going to be fighting. Just use that draw command like no tomorrow, and then set up your magics to one of your stats. Strength, defense, HP. Like, it's literally endless. And it's also a little bit broken too, so if you're like a scrub, you can definitely break the game to have like 4,000 HP from the start if you craft Kiragas from the refined system in the game, which is again another really innovative thing that Final Fantasy VIII brings to the table is the refined system. Not to mention that Final Fantasy VIII puts a lot, and I mean a deep amount of emphasis on summons, where summons were, yeah, kind of useful in 7, but they were literally just super attacks. Summons are basically like you junction them to yourself, and they're kind of what gives you your powers. Think how in Final Fantasy 13, when you get labeled a L'Cie with the L'Cie brand, that's what gives you your powers. Well, in Final Fantasy VIII, it's capturing a GF like freaking Pokemon, and basically just junctioning itself to that, and that's what gives you your powers. And each GF has its own set of powers, so let's just say something like Bahamut will be a very strength-focused one, or Diablos, or whatever. It'll be strength-focused. Then somebody like Shiva will be mainly magic-focused, and, you know, there's lots of different abilities that you can do. You can refine them, you can set them up. It's basically like a whole little system. You train your GFs, and I've always found that incredibly cool. And junctioning your GFs, and not to mention junctioning your magic to your stats, is what's going to be winning you this game, because Final Fantasy VIII isn't really a game. You can actually beat the game stock level if you want to, because enemies level up with you. So technically, Ultimecia, her lowest level can be like level 10 in the final battle. You can like base it at whatever level you want. It's going to be hard no matter what, so you can't just power level to simply beat a boss. That's not the way that Final Fantasy VIII rolls. Which is probably a reason why a lot of newcomers didn't really like Final Fantasy VIII. It's because it is massively more challenging than 7, but as a devout fan of the series, that's what I mainly like about it so much. It's not really a kick you in the balls kind of Dark Souls hard, but it's definitely more of a throwback to games like 4 with its challenge, which is definitely well needed in my opinion, as 6 and 7 were two of the easiest games of the franchise. But let me tell you, the thing that'll win your heart over, no matter your skill level, what your preferences are on games, and that was terrible pronunciation, but I'll just continue to roll with it, is the music of Final Fantasy VIII. Hands down the second best OST of the entire franchise in my opinion. From the very first song of the frickin' game, which, fascinating fact, it was actually used the opening theme of Final Fantasy VIII as the Sydney 2000 Olympic starting tournament thing song, or whatever you want to call it. Basically the part where the guy runs up with the torch is the Olympics, huzzah! Yeah, they used the Final Fantasy VIII theme song for that, and that's pretty frickin' special. And that's a true testament to how good the music was of Final Fantasy VIII. And then the very first opening sort of level or ground that you play in, Balam Garden, is probably one of the most beautiful little pieces of music I've ever heard in a game. I just adore it. So the composition, and not to force your way, the boss fight themes of Final Fantasy VIII is actually my favorite of the series. So Nobuo Uematsu, it's hands down his greatest work is Final Fantasy VIII. And coupled with, like I said, the beautiful scenery and everything, it's just a pleasant experience all around. For the palette, at least, the visual, artistic, and yeah, I guess artistic palette. It's just a beautiful game all around. Now, well, you wanna know what actually makes this all really frickin' cool? It's the fact that there's not one character in Final Fantasy VIII that I dislike. I actually say the whole cast of Final Fantasy VIII is probably one of the best rounded of all the JRPG genre. Now sure, a lot of people might complain like, oh, Squall Lionheart, he is the ultimate emo protagonist ever. And I just sit there scratching my head like, really? Like, did you ever finish Disc 1? Because you'd freaking know how much character development Squall Lionheart gets through his adventures of Final Fantasy VIII. Especially when he starts opening up to Rinoa when she falls unconscious. Oh yeah, massive spoilers, because she falls into a coma, because ultimately she tries to take over her body from the future, yeah. This game does time travel, a lot of it, and it gets pretty confusing, and yeah, the story of Final Fantasy VIII isn't super well-rounded, but overall, I think of it like a Back to the Future kind of thing, where it just might not make sense all the time, but just sit back and enjoy the ride because it's freaking fun. But I feel like the characters of Final Fantasy VIII go really human. Like, Final Fantasy VII had 3 characters that succeeded, but every single character of 8 is so well fleshed out. Like, what other game before would have backstories like Squall suffering with the loss of losing basically his sister figure, and never being able to trust anybody again because of it? Like, this shit is deep. It's really deep. And you know, as much as it sounds silly at first glance, but I was having a pretty shitty life when I was playing Final Fantasy VIII. Not the best times for me. So I actually related to the mopey shit. I've been saying shit a lot, but I don't really care. I was actually relating to this, and for a little bit, Squall was actually my favorite Final Fantasy character because of it. Literally just play the game and find out for yourself, because he gets the most character development out of any character I've ever seen. It's just astounding piece of storytelling, his character. So whereas the story kind of falters, the stories around the characters and how well they're done, I can overlook past the really confusing plot of 8. Like, there's just lots of plot holes where it's just like, unmistakably, they all lived in an orphanage. Every single one of our party were all in an orphanage together, except for Rinoa. And they just forgot about it. They just forgot about their past, because it turns out by junctioning GFs, you lose your memories over time, and it's pretty bizarre. That's like a perfect example of Final Fantasy VIII storytelling. But then you look at scenes like Waltz for the Moon during Squall's Seed graduation party, and it's just, you overlook it because the character storytelling is so good. And I'm not a dude that really cares about having a cohesive story. Just as long as the characters are good, that I'm happy. Because what happens if the story is really good, but you could care less about the characters? There's no drive for you to continue on. Whereas if you care about the characters, there's actually drive. You want to continue on to see where they go. But if the story is interesting, but you dislike every character, I'm sorry, I'm not going to have any drive to finish it, because whether you live, you die, I don't give a crap what happens to you. But whereas every character in Final Fantasy VIII, I wanted them to find their happiness at the end of the game. I wanted Irvine to be able to be a complete perv around selfie. I wanted Squall to end up with his Rinoa. I wanted Zelda to get those damn hot dogs. I just wanted everybody to get their happily ever after, and they do! which is an incredibly rare thing for Final Fantasy, but yes, we get a proper happy ending for Final Fantasy VIII. I mean, aside from the really confusing time compression stuff that happens before, we actually get a tried and true happy ending in a Final Fantasy game. And there's no room for a sequel either. Like, the story just wraps up super nicely, and that's the game for you right there. It was a nice 40-hour experience that nobody will ever forget when they play it. But Final Fantasy VIII is so different from the Final Fantasy norm. Like I said, not only is leveling up kind of a non-issue, but the way that you upgrade your equipment is weird, because you have to find these magazines. Yeah, and that's how actually you learn Zell's limit breaks as well, as through these magazines, and that's how you get Renoa's Angelo abilities as well. You have to train her dog via like Timber Maniacs, which is the dog magazine that you learn how. So yeah, it's definitely interesting the way that you expand your equipment and limit breaks in Final Fantasy VIII. Although Squall, his limit breaks are a little bit different, his Renzo Kuken, where his limit breaks, like say Fated Circle, they're attached to weapons, and the only way that you can get his best limit break is to create Lionheart, his ultimate weapon. And Lionheart is the most broken limit break in the entire series because it's an instant kill to anything but all of one enemy, Omega Weapon, which is the super boss of the game. What if I told you I beat Final Fantasy VIII only using the sheer trigger? Which is like Squall's third gunblade that you can equip. Oh yeah, the gunblade, how could I miss that? Yeah, Final Fantasy VIII, in terms of combat, tried to be a little bit more fleshed out and entertaining. So instead of just pressing the X button attack and then having your character attack, there's a little bit more to it. By pressing the R1 button, you can deliver more damage if timed correctly, and this can be done with pretty much every character. It's very entertaining. And Final Fantasy VIII is the first game where every character feels different because of how different their limit breaks are and such. So Quistis can use blue magic, which yes, is extremely useful. But go for somebody like Irvine, who can use all different kinds of ammos that you can craft, like demolition ammo. It's just bonkersly powerful, and can usually deliver 9,999 easily. And then there's Zell with his never-ending limit break. Basically, his limit break is just a version of Tifa Lockhart's, but you can actually control it, which means it's just way better in every single way. And that's the way that I see Final Fantasy VIII. It's just a game that's way better than 7, and nobody really respects or notices that. Like, sure, it's down to personal preference at the end of the day, but objectively, the graphics are so much better than they were in 7. Like, I'm serious, just look at the difference in CG. They still look like Legos in Final Fantasy VII. And just literally 2 years later, 2 freaking years later, look at the progress that they made. It's so completely different and amazing what they were able to do. Not to mention that Final Fantasy VIII has one of the longest, most arduous but fun side quest games that you can play in the entire series, Triple Triad, which is incredibly fun with the Queen of Cards, and you can go all around the world. Like, it's a whole game experience, and that's actually mainly the easy way of how you can get Lionheart is by doing that. But if you do the Queen of Hearts side quest, you can actually get Lionheart by the end of Disc 1, which I've done before, but it's incredibly hard to do so. So only do it if you have the patience of a saint. But literally, pretty much every NPC you can play Triple Triad with. Even like the very first guy that gives you cards, like the very first NPC you meet, boom, you can play Triple Triad with them. It's just like a fun little time passer, so if you're stressed out with the game, just play a fun card game for a while. There's not too many other side quests to do in Final Fantasy VIII, but it's just that one extremely large one, but it's way more fun than you'd think it is, because usually I can't stand card games, but I was pleasantly surprised by Triple Triad. I thought it was a very fun little mini game and a pastime. The coolest thing that Final Fantasy does, though, is you're not stuck with Squall, Renoa, Zell, Irvine, Quistis. You're not stuck with them for the entire game. There's actually another story to this, and that man is the man with the machine gun, Laguna Liore. Yeah, you get to play a story 10 years in the past with a man that Squall. Well, basically what you'll do is randomly you'll pass out for no reason with Squall in the game. Like, it's really no reason, but you turned out it's actually Squall's sort of adapted sister figure alone doing this to them, because she has some kind of weird powers that allows them to see in the past. Again, that's the story logic of Final Fantasy VIII. It's just bonkers, but you just roll with it because it's fun. You get to travel through completely different areas and do completely different things and fight completely different boss fights with completely different junctions. It's amazing. They actually put a whole half of a game inside another game. Well, I wouldn't say half of a game, but 30% of the game you are playing as Laguna. How cool is that? no other game I've ever played has like such seamless transitions between story. Like, I think they tried doing that with Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance, but they failed miserably at it with the drop gauge. Instead, it's just so well timed out with the story of Final Fantasy VIII, it's just an addition that I adored. And not to mention that Laguna's fight theme, Man with the Machine Gun, naturally, that's why I queued him in with Man with the Machine Gun, is hands down the best battle theme of the entire game. It's just so addictingly awesome to listen to. And he's such a refreshing take from Squall. Like, during this one, yeah, Squall's pretty much emo. Like, Quistis goes to him like midnight, it's a beautiful night. Quistis, you can tell Quistis kind of has a crush on Squall. She tries talking to him, and Squall basically replies, just go talk to Wall, this is better than I will. So, it's a very great break, like, just Laguna's very upbeat personality trying to impress some girl, and his legs are shaking, they go nuts, and he starts blabbering on like an idiot. It's just a complete opposite that was well needed. It was a balance. So Squall and Laguna are definitely the balance of the game where, yeah, sometimes you do need the Squall, but sometimes you need the Laguna, and I just think it's perfectly well executed. And not to mention, Kiros and Ward are pretty good characters in their own right, except Ward loses his ability to talk. But he still gets his points across, I guess, but oddly, he is like sort of the dead weight of the group. It's definitely Kiros and Laguna that carry that team indefinitely. And, oh, how could I go out without actually really talking about Cypher, who's sort of, I guess you could say, Squall's Vegeta, the rival figure of the game. He's really good, and he wants to live his romantic dreams with a witch. Because, I mean, who doesn't want to live a romantic dream with a hot witch that shouldn't be hot and is just awkwardly hot? And I'm just saying hot because it's hot, alright? It's just so bad. But basically, that's just a giant love triangle sort of thing where Renoa was originally in love with Cypher, then she goes and falls in love with Squall, and then it's just a whole bunch of love triangle thing, and yeah. But at least there's some pretty entertaining boss fights, so I'll give it that. Although it kind of makes me question Renoa, how literally Squall and Cypher are complete polar opposites of each other. So it's kind of straight to us, like, I love Cypher, and then she goes immediately and falls in love with the polar opposite of Cypher, Squall. And it's just, alrighty then. I mean, you're an incredibly sweet gal, Renoa, no doubt, the second best female character of the series, but damn, you are a flip-flop of a mind changer, let me tell you. But like I said, what always brings me back to Final Fantasy VIII and makes me remember it so fondly is, there was really nothing bad in Final Fantasy VIII. There wasn't that one moment just like, I didn't like that. Like, there's a lot of mini-games in Final Fantasy VII that I just hate with a burning passion. But 8's a game that I can play as a whole and enjoy every single thing about it, which is completely different for that series for me, is because 6 had some things I didn't like, 4 had some things I didn't like, a lot of the games had something like, and actually, straight from Final Fantasy 1 to 3 were just freaking glorified grinding and pretty much nothing else. So 8 is that first game that I'd actually deem perfection. Simple perfection from a pretty much perfect series. And you know, a lot of people remember Final Fantasy 7 seeming like Cloud dressing up as a girl and, oh, so is that what you want, Daddy? To like Don Cornelio or whatever, so a lot of people remember that, like Cloud Stripe being a transvestite, but the humor of Final Fantasy VIII, when it's well timed, is damn funny. And oddly enough, pretty disgusting too. So a scene is, you can go back to Ballin Town, not Squall's house, but Zell's house, and if your team is, that you choose to go back, is Zell, Selphie, and Squall, basically, Zell is a neat freak, which you wouldn't expect from him because basically yelling is his character trait, and he's always a slacker riding that T-board like, oh, Zell, you're just a slacker that likes hot dogs. I could probably make some jokes about hot dogs and Zell, but I'm not going there. But it'll be, no, Selphie, don't touch that. Don't touch this. Don't touch that. And then Selphie will sit on his bed like, geez, Zell, I didn't think you could be so anal. And then they both start fighting, and then we have Squall, who shakes his head going, Zell, you have an incredibly attractive woman on your bed that mentioned the word anal and you're complaining? Yeah, we go there. Like, literally anal sex jokes in Final Fantasy VIII. So, that's just some things that I take away from it. It's incredibly charming, and it's aged well. Like, that's my thing about Final Fantasy VIII. It was just a game that was ahead of its time. And I feel like if people play it now, they might be able to appreciate it more. The game is definitely not old school, it's new school, and I could just talk about this game for hours and hours and hours on end, but basically to sum it up, Final Fantasy VIII is just a simply gorgeous game that, yes, has some flaws in the gameplay department, like the junctioning system can be a little bit clunky at times, but and the story is quite hard to follow with the time travel and basically a witch from the future sending herself past to the past and controlling Adea. Adea, you think is the bad, like the villain of the game, but definitely not. She's actually the caregiver that used to run the orphanage that Squall and the gang were living at. So basically, Adea is sort of the whole party's mother when you think about it. So she's definitely not the villainess of the series. That it would be Ultimisha, and she's in the future, and she's awkwardly hot, and she's, oh my god, what the hell? Why is she so awkwardly hot? That's bad Tetsuya Nomura. You gotta stop freaking making your characters in the Bishonen style. You just stop. Stop. Is Bishonen, like, hot? Is that what it means? Yeah, you gotta cut it out, mister. You gotta cut that out. But I'll say that pretty much wraps things up quite nicely here. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more impressions in the future. Leave a comment below, or I might do a poll on Twitter whether or not I should cover Final Fantasy IX, because Final Fantasy IX isn't a game that I have tons to say about it, because I actually deem Final Fantasy IX my least favorite of the series. Because it's just a game that I never personally clicked with all that well. Like, it definitely has its moments that I could talk about a little bit, but it's just not a game that I have a passion over. However, if people wanted to see it, I will see it as the first episode of this Final Fantasy VII Impressions. Got over 50 views, which is really amazing for me. So, people are literally willing to listen to a 17-year-old kid from Canada bang on his mind about Final Fantasy, like whatever comes to my stream of consciousness, which is really humbling. So I just want to thank you guys for sticking around for almost 5 minutes in this video. It truly means a lot to me. But with that being said, this is the Dodo Wrestling Fan signing out.